My father left me for his new wife, who was turning his wallet into a bottomless black hole. He thought everything was under control until he caught her with his business partner. Now, he's at my doorstep crying, begging for help. But it's too late. What I told him in response shattered his world. My name is Mike, and I'm 27 years old. Until recently, my life was pretty much textbook. Job, fine. Apartment, better than most, and future plans, mapped out to the tiniest detail. But all of that went down the drain when my father, deciding he was young again, left me for his new wife, Emma. To be honest, she's 30, but looks 22 with a twist. Platinum blonde hair, makeup that seems to be done in the dark, and the manners of a professional gold digger. I had a feeling she didn't just randomly stumble into his life, but what could I do? My father is a grown man, obviously doesn't need advice. So, I figured, let him figure it out himself. She pretended to be all into him, and he acted like he didn't notice that all that glitz smelled too much like money. Months went by, and it seemed like they had become the new, perfect couple. Every time I'd visit, my father would hug me and ask with a fake smile, "How are you, son?" And I'd think, how can things be okay when you're married to a walking fashion magazine? Then one day, he said it straight to my face. "Listen, Mike, I'm no longer interested in you. I have a new family. You're an adult, you'll manage." What? Not interested? It was like your favorite t-shirt telling you it's moving in with someone else. Unreal. I held back then, though I really wanted to tell him everything I thought right in his face. Well, if that's what you want, live your perfect life, Johnny. Yeah, sometimes I call him by his name in my head, just to show him I don't care either. One day, I decided to drop by unannounced. And what do I see? Emma, lounging on the couch with a glass of expensive wine like it's her usual Tuesday, no shame in her eyes, looks at me with a lazy smirk and says, "You're not supposed to be here, Mike." Yeah, of course, because apparently, I'm not needed here at all. At that moment, it became clear that she already felt like she owned the place, to the point where she didn't care who stood before her husband's son, or just a neighbor borrowing sugar. But the real problem wasn't even that. The problem was that she was slowly, but surely driving my father away from everything that mattered to him. My father became a shadow of himself. He used to be a man who could hold any conversation, confident, but now he was just a shell. I noticed it the next time we crossed paths. Catching him at home, I thought I'd talk to him directly, but no chance. My father looked so lost I barely recognized him. He looked like Emma had turned off the light inside him. I tried bringing up how weird Emma was, but he wasn't listening. He looked at me with an expression like I was some unwelcome guest and quietly, almost emotionlessly, said, "Mike, you're an adult. Emma and I have our own lives. We need more time for ourselves." What was truly wild, my father started spending money on Emma in amounts I couldn't even imagine. A new car? Sure. Designer dresses so expensive she wore them once and tossed them in the closet. No problem. And trips to the Maldives and other tropical spots became a monthly thing, like they lived in a resort with a subscription plan. Every time I went to their house, it felt like I had stepped into a show called How to Blow a Fortune on Nonsense. Emma openly displayed her indifference toward my father, who, poor guy, was burning with the desire to please her. She looked at all these gifts as if he owed them to her just for existing, like it was her natural right to drain his bank account left and right. And then, at some point, I realized something is seriously off. And not just off, catastrophically wrong. The more my father tried to make her happy, the colder she became. It was like trying to warm an iceberg. Futile, but he didn't see it. He was blind. And I watched, unable to believe he didn't notice. Things got even worse when I heard from an acquaintance that she wasn't just ruining my father. "Emma's messing around with Tom," he said with a smirk, "and it's no joke." Tom was my father's business partner. Can you believe it? That guy always seemed a bit off, too friendly. Now I understood why. Of course, I couldn't believe it right away. I couldn't just go to my father empty-handed and say, "Hey, Your wife's cheating on you with your business partner. That wouldn't work. My father, head over heels in love, definitely wouldn't believe me. So I decided to check for myself. One evening, I followed them. And there they were, Emma and Tom. A casual stroll downtown, followed by a luxurious restaurant. They acted like a couple, not business partners. Expensive wines, laughter, looks that said everything. At that moment, I felt my anger boiling inside. I was on the verge of walking up to them and ruining everything. But I held back. Thoughts were racing in my head. What if I'm wrong? After all, if I told my father and he didn't believe me, that would be the end of everything. I saw Tom hugging her as they disappeared into a hotel. I had enough evidence. But now another question arose. What to do with it? Break my father's heart or let him continue living this lie? Emma started sensing that I was getting too close to her dirty little secret. At first, she pretended everything was fine, smiling, throwing out casual compliments like, "You look great today, Mike," which sounded fake, as if she was saying it just to keep me out of her business. But all the while, I could see her eyes growing sharper. She knew I had figured her out and clearly wasn't going to let me destroy her little empire. One day at another family gathering, when my father was once again playing the role of the loving husband, pretending not to notice that his dear wife was spending more and more time away from home, Emma came up to me. At first, I thought she wanted to discuss something trivial. But no, it turned out to be much more interesting. "You know, Mike," she began, leaning toward me and lowering her voice, "you see too much and know too much. It would be best if you didn't interfere, unless you want me to make your life, well, let's say, a lot more difficult." Her eyes literally burned with icy fire, and there was that sickly sweet smile on her face that made me nauseous. Oh yes, it was a direct threat, and she knew how to manipulate. I looked at her and at that moment realized she wasn't just a woman with expensive jewelry. No, Emma was a real predator. She was ready to devour me if I got in her way. But what struck me the most was how calmly she threatened me, as if it was just her morning coffee. Drink it, and then get on with the day. No doubt about it, she was frighteningly influential and knew exactly how to manipulate those around her. Not long after that, I started noticing that my father began avoiding me. He seemed to disappear. We no longer talked as often as we used to. When I did manage to speak with him, his responses were short, as if I annoyed him. Finally, I gathered the courage and asked him directly, "What's going on? Why are you acting like I did something wrong?" And that's when I learned the whole truth. My father looked at me in a way he never had before and said, "You just can't accept that I have a new life. You're jealous. You're trying to ruin my happiness, Mike." My mind was spinning from his words. Jealous? Ruining his happiness? I couldn't believe my ears. This wasn't my father. This was some version of him molded from his love-struck illusions and Emma's manipulations. Emma had clearly worked her magic on him, planting the idea in his head that I was jealous of their perfect life. Her plan was simple: paint me as the villain who was trying to destroy his happiness. Of course, it was madness, but he believed her. And there I stood, having to defend myself instead of explaining that she was the one ruining everything. The most painful part? The more I tried to prove to him that Emma was using him, the more convinced he became that I was the enemy he needed to avoid. You know how they say that lies always come to light? Well, in the case of Emma and her affair with Tom, it didn't just surface. It exploded in an epic fashion, as if someone had opened the lid on a ticking time bomb. My father came home earlier than planned and, well, caught the entire romance live, right there in his own home. Emma and Tom were cozily settled, as if they were the main characters in some cheap soap opera. I can only imagine my father standing in the doorway, mouth agape, unable to believe his eyes. His perfect wife, his precious Emma, whom he had showered with money and gifts, turned out to be nothing more than an actress in a wildly unsuccessful play. But this plot wasn't going to have a happy ending. Naturally, Emma immediately switched to her innocent lamb mode. She burst into hysterics saying things like, "This isn't what you think, and I can explain everything." Yeah, sure, you can. I doubt that an explanation like, "Sorry, I just decided to have some fun with your business partner," would help in this situation. My father was in shock, and she clearly realized the game was up. But then came the real climax. When my father laid out all the evidence, yes, he had already suspected something was wrong. Emma stopped pretending. She packed her things so quickly, she probably broke a world record for fastest suitcase packing. And of course, she didn't forget to take a decent chunk of money from their joint account. Well, as they say, if you're going to leave, do it with flair. And there my father was, left alone, broken and devastated. This man who had always been my rock came to me that night with tears in his eyes. I stood at the door looking at him, and honestly, I'd never seen him so weak. It was as if the world had collapsed right on top of him. He held some old suitcase with her remaining things, as if hoping it would somehow bring everything back to normal. "Mike," he said, his voice trembling, "please help me. I've lost everything." These weren't the words I ever expected to hear from my father. He looked as if his life had come to an end. Everything he had lived for in the past few years had collapsed in a moment, like a house of cards. I stood there, not knowing what to say. Inside me, a storm of anger and pity raged. On one hand, I was genuinely furious. Let's be honest, I warned him that Emma wasn't who she pretended to be. But he chose her. He chose his fantasy of a happy marriage over me. On the other hand, this was my father, the man who had once meant everything to me. Seeing him like this, it was hard. He looked like a child who had just found out his favorite toy was broken, and there was no fixing it. And at that moment, I didn't know what to do. Hug him, or let him feel the full consequences of his actions. All I could do at that moment was look at him and feel the emptiness that he had created himself. After my father showed up with that pitiful, "I've lost everything," I was honestly in shock. On one hand, I was boiling with anger. Seriously, you traded me for a woman who betrayed you. You chose her, showered her with gifts, spent more money on her than I've seen in my entire life, and now, after she ran off with Tom, and your money, you come to me for help as if nothing happened. It doesn't add up, Dad. But on the other hand, he is my father. The same man who taught me to ride a bike, who supported me at graduation, who told me I could achieve anything I wanted. Yes, he made a huge mistake. Yes, he chose the wrong side, but something inside me still wanted to help him. After all, we're family, aren't we? But damn, he chose this path himself. He decided that his new life with Emma was more important than our relationship. And now, when everything has fallen apart, he just expects me to step in, lend a shoulder, and fix it all? Well, it would be easy if I weren't the same son he practically pushed out of his life for this shiny fake doll. I sat and thought about it for hours. What's the right move? Leave him to deal with his problems alone? Let him sort it out. After all, he's the one who got himself into this mess. Maybe this would be a lesson for him. Maybe he'd finally realize that his fairy tale with the perfect wife was an illusion he built for himself. But something inside me resisted. As much as I wanted to just close the door and say, "Figure it out yourself," I couldn't. He's my father. And even after everything that happened, that thought wouldn't leave me alone. As much as it hurt, I still wanted to help him get out of this mess. But helping him? Him, who ignored and forgot about me for some woman who ran off with his money. I'm not a magician who can fix other people's stupid decisions. I tried to imagine how it would go. I help him get back on his feet, we somehow deal with all these financial issues, he comes to his senses, but then what? Will he be grateful? Or will he just go back to his old ways once things settle down a bit? It became clear to me that helping him wasn't just help. In a way, it was submission. If I gave him everything he wanted now, he would just want more later. But honestly, what frustrated me the most was that he ended up in this situation at all. It's like watching someone willingly climb into a pit and then expect you to pull them out, as if you're obligated to do it. When my father showed up at the door again, looking just as miserable as the last time, I already knew this conversation wouldn't end well. He stood there with a face like his dog had just run off with his last $100, and I knew what was coming. Another, "Mike, help me, I've lost everything." But this time, I was ready. Ready not to fall for his pitiful look. He didn't even get a chance to start his speech before I stopped him with a raised hand. "Look, Dad, let's skip the theatrics. You brought this on yourself," I said, staring him straight in the eye. Silence filled the room, and I could see his expression slowly changing. He clearly wasn't expecting that. Of course, in his mind, I was supposed to be the same predictable son who always helps, no matter what. "You made your choice," I continued. "You chose Emma, chose her lies, chose to believe in that fantasy instead of believing in me. And you know what? Now you have to deal with the consequences." My words came out sharp and cold, like icy water poured on you in the dead of winter. I saw his eyes widen, and for a moment, he looked like he'd been slapped. He was clearly searching for something to say, but was too stunned. All his pathetic hopes for sympathy and help shattered against my cold indifference. He wasn't prepared for this. I knew he thought I'd give in again, that I'd stand by him, like I always had when he stumbled. But not this time. His lips quivered, as if he was about to say something. A last-ditch, "But I'm your father." But I'd had enough. "Don't. Just don't," I said, and before he could utter another word, I slammed the door in his face. My heart was pounding like I'd just run a marathon, and inside I felt a storm of mixed emotions. On one hand, there was this huge emptiness, as if I had just destroyed something important between us. But on the other hand, I knew I'd made the right choice. This was the moment I finally put an end to it all. I couldn't be the one fixing his mistakes, couldn't be the one solving other people's problems again. It turned out my father hadn't just lost his wife and his money. No, it was far worse. He had hit rock bottom. His business, which had once been successful enough to fund all of Emma's fantasies, was falling apart right in front of him. His partners turned their backs on him the moment things got dicey, and his old friends disappeared so fast it was like they'd never existed. No one wanted to deal with a man whose life had become a train wreck. Business is ruthless, and now my father was just a bleeding wound attracting the sharks. And the money he'd loved spending? Gone. As if someone had pressed the erase button. Thanks to Emma and her love for the high life, for luxury vacations and designer shopping. All the savings he'd built up over the years were flushed down the same abyss she dragged his heart into. He tried starting over, launching something new, clawing his way back to his former glory. But it was hopeless. Honestly, it was like one of those movies where the main character tries to swim against the current, but ends up drowning instead. And as it usually goes, when everything falls apart, nobody wants to be around to witness the disaster up close. My father's reputation, once golden, was now completely destroyed. People whispered about him, like some tragic example of how far you can fall. Listening to it was awkward, even for me. I heard he moved to another city. Somewhere far away, he tried to start fresh, but rumors trickled back slowly. We never spoke again. And what would there be to say? He's too proud to come back to me, and I'm not the kind of person who's going to extend a helping hand to someone who once chose not to pick me. Sometimes I do wonder what might have happened if I had helped him back then. Maybe he would have gotten back on his feet. Maybe he would have appreciated my help and realized that family is more important than all those fake relationships. But whenever I start to think too deeply about it, I remember how he threw me out of his life for Emma, for that illusion of happiness. He chose that path. He believed her, not me. And you know what? He got exactly what he deserved. In this story, I'm not the hero. I'm not the savior who rushes in when everything falls apart. I'm the guy who made a choice to leave him to deal with the mess he created himself.